In the early 2000s, the Beatles' music surged back into cultural consciousness with the release of One, reminding the world that their songs were more than history. They were inheritance. Hello to all you classic music lovers, the cool gentlemen of the good old days, and even now. Let's rewind time and enjoy a heartwarming wave of nostalgia together. Among them, Paul McCartney embodied melody and warmth, his voice and songwriting capturing a sense of optimism that transcended generations. From Hey Jude to I Will, his work radiated emotional clarity, balancing the heavier introspection of Lennon and Harrison with a luminous, timeless charm. Within the band, McCartney's polished pop sensibilities often contrasted sharply with his bandmates' more experimental leanings. Yet that creative tension defined the Beatles' brilliance. For every mystical or abstract track, there was a light-hearted counterpoint like When I'm 64 or Obla Di, Obla Da. Behind the smiles and harmonies lay a quiet rivalry of taste and temperament. But that very friction between the profound and the playful was what made the Beatles' sound eternally alive. When the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, died of a drug overdose in 1967, the band's future was thrown into chaos. For a moment, no one knew what would become of them. And then Paul McCartney stepped forward. He filled the vacuum, taking on the unofficial role of leader and organizer, urging the others to keep working, to stay creative, to move forward. But his determination came with a cost. John, George, and Ringo began to bristle under his direction. What McCartney saw as responsibility, they saw as domination. Years later, Lennon would admit that Paul's leadership kept the Beatles alive in the immediate aftermath of Epstein's death. Yet in the same breath, he accused Paul of being self-serving, claiming that McCartney's obsession with holding the group together was less about loyalty and more about fear. Lennon believed Paul wasn't ready to be a solo artist, that he was clinging to the Beatles because he couldn't yet imagine a world without them. But McCartney's control didn't begin with Epstein's death. It had been brewing long before. Many would argue that the Beatles always operated as a democracy, a perfect four-headed creative machine. Still, if you look closely, Rubber Soul in 1965 marked a quiet shift in power. The records that came before were dominated by Lennon, who had been the group's natural frontman. Even during their legendary Ed Sullivan Show appearance, it was John who stood in the center, bathed in his own spotlight. Yet as the albums rolled on, something began to change. The count of lead vocals tells the story. Lennon sang lead on 110 songs, McCartney on 106, nearly equal. But most of John's leads came before 1966, while most of Paul's came after. That numerical shift wasn't just trivia, it was a reflection of a deeper transformation. McCartney was quietly steering the ship. In 1966, after the exhaustion of touring, the endless screaming crowds, and Lennon's infamous "more popular than Jesus" remark,
if it had said, television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got...
The group collectively decided to stop performing live. Everyone was done, except Paul. He still longed for the stage, for that connection with the audience, for the thrill that only live music could give. And though he was outvoted, that hunger never left him. Then came 1968, the televised performances of Hey Jude and Revolution. Hey Jude, Revolution reignited his vision. The joy, the power, it was all there again. Riding that wave, McCartney convinced the others to return to the studio, this time to make an album that could be performed live. That creative spark would soon evolve into something else, something far more complicated. That's where Peter Jackson's monumental documentary, The Beatles, Get Back, begins. Released on Disney Plus over Thanksgiving weekend, the three-part series places us right inside those fateful sessions. The rehearsals and recordings that would eventually form Let It Be, and in part, Abbey Road. And at the heart of it all stands Paul McCartney. He isn't just featured, he dominates the screen. Of course, that's no accident. Those two albums were his masterpieces. His fingerprints are everywhere, from She Came In Through the Bathroom Window and Get Back to I've Got a Feeling, Golden Slumbers, and The Long and Winding Road. The camera lingers lovingly on each of them, capturing his creativity in real time. The only song given comparable attention is Lennon's Don't Let Me Down, a track that, ironically, never made it onto an official Beatles album. Still, those final records shimmer with brilliance from all sides. Harrison offered something. Lennon gave Across the Universe, and even Ringo contributed the whimsical Octopus's Garden. Yet, together, Let It Be an Abbey Road feel like McCartney's personal victory lap. In just over a year, he wrote Hey Jude, Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road, and the majority of the Abbey Road medley songs that would become cornerstones of pop music forever. He carried that same creative fire straight into the 1970s, when he recorded Maybe I'm Amazed for his wife, Linda Eastman. The song remains one of his greatest ballads, a declaration of love that also served as a bridge between his Beatles past and his solo future. Linda, who beautifully photographed the Get Back sessions, became both his muse and his partner in the next chapter of his life. Even though Get Back captures Paul McCartney's desperate efforts to hold the band together during those final sessions, the last flickers of the Beatles' unmatched brilliance, the film doesn't hide the other side of that story. His relentless drive, his need for control, and the ego that slowly cast a shadow over everything. Watching those moments, it's easy to feel both admiration and discomfort. He's the man fighting hardest for the music, but also the one unknowingly pushing his friends away. By that point, Ringo and George had already quit the band, more than once. Lennon, meanwhile, was losing interest fast. His creative focus had shifted toward politically charged songwriting with his new wife, Yoko Ono, whose presence in the studio changed the group dynamic forever. Their creative partnership was intimate and immediate, much like what Paul would later form with Linda in their band Wings. But what truly fractured the group during Get Back was McCartney's transformation of the project into a personal workshop. To him, these weren't just sessions, they were his sanctuary, a space to perfect his songs. To the others, it began to feel like they were no longer a band, but hired hands working under Paul's direction. At moments, he seemed like a conductor, orchestrating his own grand masterpiece, rather than a teammate trying to save the Beatles. The irony is heartbreaking. Beatlemania had already made them gods of popular culture, but Hey Jude made Paul McCartney a global superstar, a status that both elevated and isolated him. It pushed him further into his perfectionism and creative ambition, which inevitably came with a price. On April 10, 1970, McCartney announced that he was leaving the Beatles. The public's reaction was swift and brutal. To many, he was the villain, the man who broke up the greatest band in the world. The announcement came hand in hand with the release of his first solo record, McCartney, complete with a press statement that felt like a declaration of independence. Get Back tries to fill the gaps that led to that moment, the emotional distance, the unspoken rivalries, the creative fatigue, but McCartney's exit still feels like a thunderclap. His dissatisfaction with Phil Spector's heavily orchestrated remix of The Long and Winding Road, combined with Lennon's secret decision to divorce the group months earlier, pushed him to the edge. Lennon's departure, however, was kept quiet due to complicated contract renegotiations with Capitol Records. To the remaining three, Paul's solo album felt like betrayal, but McCartney's retreat to his farm in Campbelltown, Scotland, was not an act of defiance, it was an escape. A man exhausted by fame, haunted by the collapse of something he'd helped build, and bombarded by American tabloid rumors that he was dead. His solo work was both rebellion and recovery, a way to reclaim his voice amid chaos. It's worth noting that all four Beatles released solo records that same year, despite their supposed outrage over Paul's timing. Yet, history remembers him as the one who quit. Technically, that's true. McCartney was the only member to officially announce his departure, and I hold on to that fact because it defines both his strength and his flaw. By the time Get Back unfolds, McCartney's charming, boyish optimism had hardened into something else, an impatient insistence that only he could keep the Beatles from crumbling. His interactions with George, particularly his dismissal of All Things Must Pass, reveal a man torn between love and control. But even with his overbearing tendencies, it's clear he was fighting to save something everyone else had already given up on. The truth, though, is that Let It Be was never going to get finished the way Paul imagined. Lennon was caught in the fog of heroin addiction. Harrison, newly inspired by Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton, longed to make his own kind of music. Starr was drifting toward film roles and solo experiments. McCartney, ever the craftsman, was left trying to hold together a puzzle whose pieces no longer fit. Those whimsical moments on the Beatles and Abbey Road, the ones full of playful experimentation, were really just prototypes for what McCartney would later do with Wings. Songs like 1985 and Temporary. Secretary would carry that same mix of curiosity and confidence. In retrospect, Get Back feels less like a farewell and more like a rehearsal for Paul's next act. Grand, emotional, and deeply personal music built for arenas, not intimate clubs. After the first episode of Get Back aired, one particular moment went viral. McCartney, sitting with his bass, mumbling nonsense sounds that suddenly crystallize into the melody of Get Back. Viewers were stunned. It looked like magic, like he had pulled a song from thin air. Some called it divine inspiration. Others, more cynical, said it was just the ordinary miracle of songwriting. But that's McCartney, always blurring the line between genius and instinct. This was the same man who claimed that yesterday came to him in a dream. He could summon melodies as if they already existed somewhere in the air, waiting for him to find them. Yet, while he was experimenting freely, he wasn't so generous with others. McCartney reportedly disliked Lennon's solo songs Give Peace a Chance and Cold Turkey, both of which fans later argued would have made brilliant Beatles tracks. But the Beatles were never meant to be a space for political anthems or spiritual sermons. Lennon and Harrison needed their own worlds to explore, and McCartney, perhaps unconsciously, helped push them there. When the credits roll on Get Back, there's a quiet ache that lingers, an unspoken understanding that what we've just seen isn't merely the collapse of a band. It's the end of a cultural era, and Paul McCartney stands at the center of it like a man both triumphant and defeated. Decades later, Get Back doesn't try to rewrite history. It reframes it. We no longer see McCartney as the villain who broke up the Beatles, but as the last one still trying to hold on. His intensity, once mistaken for arrogance, now feels like desperation. An artist who simply couldn't imagine a world without the band that had defined his life. Every shot of him in the studio, tapping his foot, shaping harmonies, or guiding Ringo's rhythm carries a melancholy weight. It's not the image of a dictator. It's the portrait of someone terrified of losing everything he loves. Watching him piece together fragments of Let It Be or Get Back feels like witnessing a man trying to rebuild a crumbling cathedral with his bare hands. And yet, there's something beautiful about it. Even as the group falls apart, McCartney's belief in music never wavers. He still jokes, still sings, still dreams. His determination keeps the sessions from collapsing completely. In his stubbornness, we see his greatest flaw, but also his purest strength. Years later, he would carry that same spirit into his solo career. Wings might never have reached the mythic heights of the Beatles, but McCartney's relentless creativity ensured that his voice remained one of the most recognizable on Earth. From the bittersweet ache of Maybe I'm Amazed to the jubilant lift of Band on the Run, he refused to let nostalgia define him. And perhaps that's what makes his story tragic yet noble. McCartney didn't just lose a band. He lost a brotherhood, a shared language that only 4 people on the planet ever truly understood. Lennon's murder in 1980 sealed that loss forever, transforming their disagreements into sacred memories. By then, Paul had already written songs like Here Today, an open letter to John, filled with regret and love. It was the apology he could never say in person. Get Back reminds us that genius often walks hand in hand with loneliness. McCartney's brilliance isolated him, but it also gave us some of the most enduring melodies in modern history. His leadership wasn't perfect. It was messy, emotional, human. But without that drive, the Beatles might have faded long before their legend was written. So when we think about the Beatles' tragic breakup, maybe it's time to see it not as an ending, but as the inevitable transformation of something too great to last forever. Every note, every harmony, every argument was part of a larger symphony, a story about youth, ambition, and the price of creation, Paul McCartney, the so-called arrogant genius, emerges not as the destroyer of the Beatles, but as their last believer. He carried the dream longer than anyone else dared to. In his music, you can still hear the echoes of that dream. The laughter, the chaos, the brilliance, and the heartbreak that changed the world. And as the final chords of Let It Be fade, one truth remains. The Beatles didn't die because they failed. They ended because they became too powerful to exist as anything less than myth.